Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this Amnesty Live event. My name is Sasha Deshmukh, and I'm the Interim Chief Executive at Amnesty International UK. And I'd like to welcome everyone, particularly our panellists, who I'll introduce in a moment, to this event, What's Wrong with the Policing Bill? So, where to begin? What's wrong with the Policing Bill? Well, we oppose the bill because if it passed, we believe that it would entrench racial injustice, unacceptably limit peaceful protest, and severely restrict the right to roam. Three themes that our panellists this evening will speak about. We see the policing bill, though, as part of a coordinated attack on UK rights, part of a toxic cocktail, which also includes the Covert Human Intelligence Sources Act, the Overseas Operations Act, which until the last minute had provisions that would have effectively decriminalised torture in some cases, as well as the current Human Rights Act review and the new plans for immigration. But today, we're going to focus on the policing bill, and I'm so pleased that we're joined by three absolutely fantastic panellists. So I'll just introduce them, and I'll introduce them in the order that they'll be speaking in a moment. Femi Oluwale works alongside Deborah Frances-White, who many of you will know from the Guilty Feminist podcast, on the Noisy and Annoying campaign against the policing bill. Femi writes for The Independent and is a regular guest on the Jeremy Vine show, as well as producing video content and making media appearances that challenge the UK government on issues such as Brexit, inequality and human rights. Femi studied law with French at Nottingham University and worked in and around the EU institutions from 2014 through 2017 in Brussels and Vienna, including advocacy traineeships at the Alliance for Lobbying Transparency and Ethics Regulation, working against secretive corporate lobbying, the European Centre for Democracy and Human Rights against human rights abuses in the Gulf states, and the EU Fundamental Rights Agency. Katrina French is the founding director of Unjust CLC. Unjust is a London-based social enterprise with a national remit operating in the criminal justice field, on a mission to address structural discrimination within policing and create equality within society. Unjust understands that to achieve the much needed systemic transformation requires an inclusive and collaborative approach that actively involves, informs and empowers all of society, particularly those that are adversely impacted by policing interactions. Unjust undertakes research, advocacy and campaign activities and offers services to children and adults and operates a legal referral mechanism. And Luke Smith is a Romani Gypsy campaigner for the welfare, equality and representation of Gypsy, Roma and travellers. He's contributed various articles on issues that affect Gypsies and travellers, particularly regarding police, crime, sentencing and court bill in outlets including Tribune and Open Democracy. Luke also advises various charities on how best they can serve the community and on projects to improve the outcomes for Gypsies, Roma and travellers. He's also the founder of the campaigning group Gypsy Roma Travellers Socialist to educate the labour movement on issues and racial discrimination. Just a few housekeeping questions before I am going to move to the panellists. Questions will be submitted via the question box. We won't be using the raise hand function for this event. So just to emphasise, we hope there are lots of questions, but please do use the question box to ask those questions. And we also ask that everyone participating in today's event can help us ensure that this is a safe space and follow some ground rules when asking questions, just to ensure that we're all being respectful. Please try and keep questions specific to the discussion that we're having tonight. And let's respect each other's experiences and opinions. So in which to help that, we'll ask that we don't ask invasive questions and we all work together to make the space a safe and comfortable space for us all and for all of us. We'll recognise and respect each other's boundaries, but we will also be open to learning and accepting ideas that are new through supportive discussions. And it's in that spirit that I'm very much looking forward to this event. And I'd like to invite our first panellist to speak. And Femi, I shall hand over to you.
Hi, everybody. So outside of UK elections, which take place every 5 years, Protests are really our primary way of expressing our views on issues. Now, that means if we're talking about things like the Iraq War, how can we show the outside world that we don't support that? If we're showing stuff like the bombings in Yemen, or what's happening in the Gaza Strip, how can we show that we actually care as a people and that we aren't necessarily represented by everything that our government does? How can we achieve change outside of those 5-year intervals? Protest. Now, as far as what protest has achieved, pretty much all the rights that we've managed to get up to this point have been achieved by people being noisy and annoying at protests, raising their voice, telling the government no. I mean, if you take, for example, how subtle social changes can lead to massive developments. For example, if you look at in 1992, there was a law case. Remember, 1992 was a case in the UK which decided that a man was no longer presumed consent, irrevocable consent between a man and his wife. So a man could be charged with raping his wife. And the judge in that case cited changing social attitudes. Now, if we don't have the ability to speak out loudly and proudly, those sorts of messages won't reach the people in power. And unfortunately, we have a government that is very much against allowing us to question their actions and their policies. Be it, for example, they came out and said that you shouldn't, teachers are breaking the law if they teach that white privilege exists, even though their own government website shows that black people are stopped and searched by police 10 times more. Be it the Tobias Ellwood saying that the reason why they didn't let 16-year-olds vote in the last election was because they vote for Labour. The idea is they suppress opposition at every step. And Priti Patel has overtly said, quote, "I don't support protests." She was asked to clarify. She said, "No, I don't support the Black Lives Matter protests." But essentially her opinion was that she didn't support protests, because she then went on to say that the protests were wrong. She then went on to say that taking the knee, she disagreed with that. There's never a right way to protest. And that's kind of the attitude that leads to a bill like the one that we're seeing now. Now, this bill, the policing bill, it contains many, many things, which we'll get onto in a second. But what it does around protests is it allows police to place conditions on protests. One of those conditions can be the protest cannot be noisy enough to put people at risk of having a relevant impact. Now, it defines relevant impact as somebody at risk of feeling serious unease. Now, serious unease is the term they've used to define an illegal protest. Now, if you're an MP in Parliament passing laws which are going to ruin people's lives, and there's a protest outside and it makes you feel seriously uneasy, you can then tell the police that they've done that, and then the people in that protest, if the condition has been placed on them and they continue to raise their voice, are liable to fines of up to £2,500. And the person who actually organized the protest, they can go to jail. That's the country that we are about to start living in. Now, that is a complete violation of the basic right to protest, which is enshrined in many international treaties. And they also specifically created a clause on a one-man protest. And the reason why I did that is because there have been several. Some may have heard of Steve Bray, the anti-Brexit campaigner who stood outside Parliament for every day for 3 years. This is a very targeted approach to make sure that people that question the government cannot speak out. Now, the problem with the phrasing of this bill is, because it's serious unease, it's completely subjective. Now, if it's completely subjective, that leaves open two problems. One, nobody can go to a protest and know for sure that their actions won't later be deemed to be illegal, which means that you've effectively made all protests illegal if any protest can be illegal. Secondly, it opens the door to serious bias. Police might decide, based on their own personal views or based on the mandate from their commissioner or from the government, that certain social causes are more annoying, more likely to cause people to feel unease, simply because of their own prejudices against those issues. So we are seeing a serious attack on the basic rights to protest. And one of the problems with this thing is it will result in more violence. ironically, the government tried to use the minority of people who were violent at the Black Lives Matter protest last summer to justify this bill, even though that makes literally no sense. It's, as far as I'm aware, it's already illegal to set fire to police vans and punch police officers. Why do you need a law that makes it illegal to raise your voice at a protest? This is a completely manipulative way of getting around it. One of the most manipulative elements of it is that this bill is so wide-ranging. It covers everything from child sexual offences, violence against women, the protection of statues, which apparently you can now go to jail for 10 years for defacing, even though rape sentences start at 5 years. It covers attacks on Gypsy and Roma people. It covers police stop and search powers. Now, all of those issues are incredibly important. They require a lot of debate, and some people might feel one way on one thing, but a different way on another. But if you put all those issues together, it will eventually come to a vote on yes or no. And so the politics that what we played is, oh, if you're not willing to sacrifice the right to protest, you don't care about women, or you're okay with police violence. That's the politics that's being played here. If you cared about any of those issues, you would not put them in the same bill, but that's exactly what this government has done here. A serious attack on our right to protest, and part of a ongoing agenda that cuts out every ability for us to speak out against the government. Let's remember, we live in a country where the majority of votes in every election since the Second World War, other than 3 elections, 2015, 1958, 1955, have gone to parties that are to the left of the Conservative Party, yet the Conservative Party has been in power for 2/3 of the time. We have a country where people are already silenced democratically, and even outside of those elections, we are now at risk of being suppressed in terms of our right to protest. So this is why this is so important that we all make a loud noise about this now. And what I try and tell people is, speak now or forever fear police. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Femi. It's an excellent introduction to the discussion. I'm now really pleased to be handing over to Katrina to bring her perspective into our discussion. Katrina, over to you.
Thank you, Sasha. Thank you, Amnesty, for putting on this really timely event, and also Femi for opening up and really highlighting that this bill lumps everything together. And as soon as you start, which in a way has brought us all together. So I think there's positives in terms of how it has led to the mobilizations of women's groups, Gypsy Traveller group, Black groups. But it's really saddening that the government is ratcheting this up. So we're not coming together to celebrate. We're having to come together to try and to fight the system, which it's really frustrating. So I want to say thank you, because the bit that I want to focus on in the next 7 to 8 minutes is around the serious violence and the response. And I want to start by saying Unjust takes serious violence incredibly serious, and there's no pun intended. However, the approach that we've seen, especially over the last 4 years or so under the Conservative government, has been one that has led, in my opinion, to a growing distrust of the police, because the approaches that have been put in place have been blanket approaches that haven't all been targeted, but have been very much racially led by a lack of resource in terms of closure of youth clubs, lack of opportunities for young people, and a heavy investment in law enforcement. So I want to say, if we want to tackle serious violence, the approach that we're being given isn't going to be it. We need to get out of the retribution and get into the restoration model, and that will see the outcomes that we want. It will have the society that we want, and we'll see the social cohesion. And this bill is incredibly damning, because what it does in terms of stop and search powers, if I get onto that, is it worsens the police, the relationship between the police and who they deem to be perpetrators of serious youth violence. And we know that despite the overwhelming number of people committing violence being white, because Black people are a minority in this country, the media perception is that it is just a Black crime as opposed to a societal problem. And what this bill does is really reinforce that perspective by creating measures that we've seen in the past via the gangs matrix will allow public sector agencies and others to share information about young people, or people that are, I'm going to at risk, and the term at risk is so broad that it basically means anyone that kind of might live in a rough neighborhood, anybody that might have been a victim of crime, or, you know, not done very well at school. It's a very catch-all approach, and what we're seeing is an expectation that, and whilst it's not individual teachers, but teachers, educational providers, who else we see in public health services, who else, youth services, are having to share information about young people they deem to be at risk with the police. And whilst this sounds like a great approach, I should say it already happens, so there is no new law. For me, there is no need to introduce this prevent style agenda that then circumvents, in my opinion, people's right to privacy, having their innocence before being proven guilty, that presumption of innocence. Also, the fact that they go to some of these agencies for trust and to try and be rehabilitated, and then information shared with them with the police. And often the police approach is one about law enforcement. And what we know about people when they do get involved in the criminal justice system is that their outcomes afterwards are very, very low. So if you go to prison, it's very difficult for you to get a job afterwards. So what we're trying to advocate is that we really need to reimagine what society looks like, and what this bill does is actually more of the same, but at a much worse way. It's seeing the demonization of people who may have been present when a crime was committed, but they themselves didn't have a weapon on them, but actually now can be subject to a serious violence reduction order. And that is people that have not been caught with a weapon themselves. And I say that because we saw the impact of joint enterprise and guilty by association. And what this is enabling that by the back door. Often when we've been teenagers, I'm going to put my hand up, as if there was a fight, loads of people at 15 are running towards it just to see what's going on. Even at lunchtime, you're saying there's a fight afterwards, you know, there's a bit of excitement. Now, if your child runs towards that fight and the weapons used in that, they could find themselves in court and also subject to a serious violence reduction order, which means that for up to 6 months to 2 years, the police can stop them in any public place at any time without any reasonable grounds. And that is a significant shift from the laws that we have in the moment. The Police and Criminal Evidence Act PACE is 35 years this year. And for all its faults, and it has many in terms of reasonable grounds, not being incredibly reasonable, what it does provide is that people will have to be told why they're being stopped, and that legislation speaks to that moment. When you have a serious violence reduction order, you literally could just be popping to the shop and be stopped because you look like someone who the police think you have this order in place. And you also know that the police seem to think that all Black people look the same. That's why we've got that high rate of disparity, because every IC3 male looks the same. So if you then have legislation that says, I think you might be on this register, so I'm stopping you and you need to give me your information. And if you refuse to give your information, that could be seen as obstruction. So it's allowing the police to have powers that are completely unnecessary. They're not based in any evidence. The efficacy hasn't been made. And what we do know is that the impact is going to be incredibly harsh for young people living in areas of socio-economic disadvantage, not because they themselves are involved in crime, but because that area is involved with crime. So that means that the police have, in their opinion, a reason to be there, and that then means they have a reason to stop and search people because they're doing their jobs, because this is a high crime area. And this bill does nothing in the way of providing the trust and confidence or actually reducing serious violence. Actually, I would say it turns it on its head, because what it does is bring people into the criminal justice system and then not enable them to have necessarily the confidential relationships that they would like to have with other services where they could get that rehabilitation. And we have to just be really careful. As I said, I think we're at a point in society where we should be reimagining what we want from policing and promoting safety and empowering people. And this bill does none of those things. It really does undermine the fabric of our society, the right to protest, the right to, if you commit a crime, to not be having it hang over your head again and again. And we all know if you are told you're going to be bad and you're forever told that, you might live that out. So let's have a police service that catches criminals, yes, but doesn't create them. And let's have a criminal justice system that enables people to have a second chance. And I think it's just really important that people go to their MPs, that they understand bits of the bill that appeal to them. So it's a very big bill. So, you know, find the bit that you're interested in and then just get to know that and think, does this feel right? Does this sit right? And before I kind of be quiet, I want to highlight that there's a real problem around policing technology here. So biometric fingerprint scanner is already in use. My real fear is that it will be used by the police to identify people who have these orders. Now, when you're giving your fingerprint, I strongly believe that should be done in a police station. You know, there's just certain things that shouldn't be done on the roadside. We live in a civilized society. What's this all about? And what we're seeing is the introduction or the embedding of technology in a way that we don't know it. So we just have to be really mindful of the ethics around this, as well as the impact and the numbers. It's unethical, it's immoral, and it doesn't help the society. So yeah, we should all be opposing this, and that's kind of my 2 pence on this for the moment.
Thank you so much, Katrina. And I think there were, lots of excellent points within that. And this is my moment, I think, to just remind everyone about the question box, because I think there'll be lots of the points that you've raised where hopefully there'll be lots of questions. So just a reminder, we're not going to be using the raised hand function for questions. We're going to be using the question box, and we'll be taking questions right after Luke has spoken. So I am going to, without any further ado, hand over to Luke.
Hello, everybody. Thanks for having me, Amnesty. It's a pleasure to be here. So I'll be talking about something that impacts particularly my community and the Irish traveller community. So I'm a Romany Gypsy. Gypsies and Irish travellers are affected seriously in this bill. There's a whole section 4, that's dedicated to the eradication of, our historic ways of life. We've existed in this country for centuries and centuries, and people have been nomadic. Since the beginning of time, since the beginning of humanity, really. For 99% of human history, people have been nomadic, and this bill seeks to end the way of life for 15 to 20% of the Gypsy and traveller population in this country. They're often people with some of the poorest outcomes in this country, so they have the poorest educational attainment. We have the worst health outcomes. We often die 12 years younger than the rest of the population. We experience serious abuses from the police, to be honest with you. We face violent evictions. And people often think about unauthorised encampments when they think about gypsies and travellers. That's, like I say, that's actually caused by the government, and I'll explain why that is. In this country, there is actually a massive lack of permanent sites for gypsies and travellers. There's a massive lack of transit sites for those who still live nomadically. There's an even bigger shortage of local authorities engaging in what's called negotiated stopping, which is when gypsies and travellers come to your local area, they stop there, and then the council goes, oh, well, actually, we've got a more appropriate piece of land. We'll provide you with toilets and access to rubbish disposal. Obviously, that gets rid of the whole issue around rubbish and everything else. And there's a big shortage of that, like I say. Our community experienced police brutality, and it's not just from unauthorised encampments, but it's from things like Dale Farm. Dale Farm was a big eviction that happened in 2010. That was land that gypsies and travellers owned. This isn't some council land. This isn't, the kind of, we experienced wide scale evictions. But if you want to see the sheer violence that we experienced from the police, well, go have a look at the Dale Farm eviction. Go have a look at the police brutality we experienced, where they drag an Irish traveller woman across a common land while she's pregnant and epileptic, so violently she has an epileptic fit. Go look at the videos where a man almost gets his leg torn off by a police dog that was out of control, and the police officer said something racial towards the victim, who, by the way, wasn't actually guilty of any crime. So that just puts it in perspective. Now, I'll tell you that, so I've outlined the status quo as we get it now. So this is the police who cannot handle the authority and the powers that they already have. Now, this bill gives them more powers. So what this bill does, it doesn't solve unauthorised encampments. It doesn't provide people with places to live. It doesn't give them better education. It doesn't give them community funding for grassroots boxing and the rest of it. What this bill does is it's proposing, number one, £2,500 fines for some of the most vulnerable, poorest families in the country. Number two, I've already explained about police brutality my community faces. This bill gives the police the power to seize our vehicles and our homes, otherwise known to you maybe as caravans. We call them trailers. It gives them the power to seize trailers and vehicles that we use to work and earn our living and support our families and feed our children. It gives them, if they think we have the intent to reside on a piece of land, it gives them the power to seize all of that on site. And it basically seizes them to the point where we wouldn't be able to get them back until criminal proceedings have taken place. As we know with the funding of the justice system, that could be a year to 2 years for all we know. So these people have gone from unconventionally homeless with a roof over their head, now they're conventionally homeless and they don't even have a roof over their head. So like I say, if they wanted to solve unauthorised encampments, this shouldn't even be with the Home Secretary. This should be with the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government. Provide more sites, provide more transit sites, and provide more negotiated stopping. Now, the worst part, as if that wasn't bad enough, number 3. Well, number 3 is about the suggestion, it's about putting into law 3-month prison sentences for people who don't have anywhere to go. So I've already explained they are, unconventionally homeless. So 3 months prison sentences. Now, if I give you an example of a family with 3 small children, they're on an unauthorised encampment. They've now been criminalised. So it was a civil offence. This is making it a criminal offence. Not only will they get a £2,500 fine, which they potentially can't afford. Number 2 is potentially they'll get their homes and their vehicles seized by the police. And now the third one is that they'll get 3-month prison sentences. Now, what happens, when 2 parents are put in prison for 3 months? What happens to the children? Oh, they get taken into care. And shock horror, in this country, there is actually a history of them forcibly adopting gypsy and traveller children. That's been happening for decades and decades. And actually, the kind of families that I grew up in, my family, we know lots of other families that have been through this, where people have put themselves forward to take that child. They have no criminal records or anything, and they've been deliberately bypassed for a non-gypsy and traveller family, and bypassed all their family members to put them with a racist family which call us the P word. That's actually happened, and that's happened quite commonly. Like I say, nomadism isn't weird. That's the human default, as much as people don't want to take that into account. We were here before this system even existed, for 2. And like I say, none of this makes our poor outcomes any better. If you want to make us more educated, surely giving us a place to live so we have more access to schools, surely that's a better way of doing it. Surely if you want to make our health outcomes better, approve more sites in locations that aren't built upon toxic waste disposal tips. Surely if you want to solve crime in our community, surely grassroots investment so that people have access to, because at the minute we're socially excluded. We can't go to pubs, bars and everything else. We can't get jobs on building sites or anywhere else because they say we don't employ the P words, the T words or the K words here. We can't go out for with our families for dinner with anybody. Like, genuinely, we are segregated from much of this country. When they talk about no-go areas, this whole country is a no-go area for minorities like us, and it's often outside of cities. It's often a no-go areas for Black people, for other Muslims, for other minorities as well. So let's take that into account. This bill, to finish off with, to conclude, this bill is a slip into authoritarianism. This country, bills like this, when they come after minorities like us, this is a society crying out for help. This is pulling the alarm on what a democracy should look like. Like I say, it's criminalizing minorities. It's not just not on unauthorized encampments. They have provisions to secure schools, bridging the gap between schools and prisons, funneling children from schools to prisons, not trying to take them off that path, like Katrina said, putting them actually into the criminal justice system where they wouldn't have necessarily even come across it before. We get profiled actually, when in places like Northern Ireland, it's Irish travellers that are the people that are the victims of stop and search. So that just puts it in perspective. We're racially profiled. Our youth are stopped when they're going to work and their life are infringed upon. What I would say is, electoral politics might not be able to save us at this point. We've got a big conservative majority. But what I will say is that they are coming for you next. They will come for trade unions. Protest will be illegal, and that also means picket lines will be illegal. That also means, look at what they're doing to Stonewall. They're coming after Stonewall. They'll come after Amnesty International. They'll come after all these charities. So make sure you're out on the streets now demanding that we make this bill ungovernable and we make them, you know, shove it where the sun doesn't shine, to want of a better phrase. I know that's probably a bit crude, but yeah, thank you for having me.
Thank you so much, Luke and Katrina and Femi, for those introductions, which are fantastic. We've already got some questions coming in. If people see my eyes dart down, it's only so I can take note of the questions and help to share those. What I'm going to do for the questions, we're actually adding an extra face for the questions. So hopefully on screen in a second, you should see my colleague, Ollie Sprague, who's one of our programme directors, and he's Amnesty's policy lead on the policing bill. And he's going to be able to join us with his experience and expertise, and also particularly help with questions to do with Amnesty stance and what Amnesty can do as part of this movement and part of this coalition. I'm going to begin with a question that partly actually picks up something Luke just said about the electoral politics of the situation. By the way, I'll go round panelists, but panelists, feel free to, you know, raise your arm and make clear to me that you want to come in first. I want to hear people who want to come forward. No need to feel shy, certainly. So the question is, if we do have, as Luke kind of pointed to, a strong Conservative majority, the questioner says, and I think there's definitely something in what they say, you know, we have an opposition that perhaps is afraid to oppose or not opposing with the force that we might. What's the panel's view about the literally the electoral, the legislative maths around this, and what does that mean in terms of perhaps the focus of protests that you think we might want to make? Femi, as you spoke first, I hope you don't mind if I just start you first with this particular question, and then I'll go around to other panelists as well.
So in terms of the electoral map, there's no getting around the fact that the Tories have a majority of 80 MPs, and it is the Conservative Party that is proposing this bill. Where there's scope is winning over Tory MPs on the basis of their core ideology. Now, if you think about what the Conservative Party is supposed to stand for, it's supposed to stand for small government, a bill that goes right into the lives of citizens and says that they can't raise their voices of protest is the exact opposite of what the Conservative Party is supposed to stand for. There's also a very strong right-wing libertarian section within the Conservative Party, headed up by Steve Baker, and I called him out on Twitter recently to make sure that he was on the right page on this, and he said that he was. He did oppose the elements of this bill. He said it did go too far. Whether or not he's going to vote for it, that's what's up for debate. So we need to put pressure on those MPs who are naturally inclined towards the whole free speech side of things because of their right-wing views, and basically try and work with them in that respect. As far as the electoral maths, yeah, obviously we need Labour on board, but we do need some Tories as well.
Katrina or Luke or Ollie, would you like to add anything to that question? I've got quite a few questions, so I can keep going through to get more in, but if anyone would like to add, do you want to just raise your hand? Luke, yeah, come on in.
Yeah, so when I say electoral politics can't save us potentially now because they've got an 80-seat majority, and it's likely, you know, the Lords will probably try and table some amendments, but, you know, we'll see how far that goes. Look, these right-wing libertarians, right, they all say that they're all for, freedom for everybody and all this, but what they mean is freedom for white rich men. That's what they mean. That's it. That's all it goes. Freedom for corporations to exploit people, freedom for the police to brutalize, you know, racial minorities, things like that. That's what they mean. That's what their freedom stands for. And they all go, oh, I'll oppose it, and then they all go along and they queue up and vote for it anyway. So let's just forget about those Tory MPs, because honestly, you've got more hope in Santa Claus coming down and saving us from this bill. That's my personal view. Look, this bill is going to make all these things illegal, right? It's going to make protests illegal. What has to be done is that members of civil society have to, charities, unions, everybody has to get out on the streets and make it ungovernable. That is the only way we're going to get them to take this back. We already delayed it once, Sisters Uncut, led by black women, having to take the brunt of everything again and having to carry everybody and try and stop our society descending into madness. Let's follow their lead. Why don't we follow their lead? They've been successful at delaying it once. Get out on the streets and demand better. Keir Starmer's meant to be a human rights lawyer, right? where's his human rights now? When our community, they said that they was going to oppose it the day before this bill went through. I don't know what they've been teaching him at Oxford, but he needs to really get his books out again, because this is an affront to every human rights law that's ever come out, ever. So yeah, that's all I would say. Electoral politics won't save you. It's about time that the middle class and everybody from civil society gets out on the streets and makes it ungovernable, like the poll tax, like other things, and then we'll get rid of the bill that way. Thank you.
Thank you, Luke. And actually, I'm going to come to Katrina as the first voice on the next question, if I may. And actually, it flows in some ways relatively well, actually, from the point that Luke was just making. But Katrina first, and obviously others to come in. The question is, how best can we take, and what kind of shape should we best take positive action when COVID restrictions are still in place? So what are the spaces in which we can have the loudest, clearest voice when COVID restrictions are still in place? What advice do panelists have on that? Katrina, is it okay if I start with you for that, please?
Yeah, I think, it's been really difficult in some ways, being in physical space, but I want to commend the attendees here, because this is the sort of space you need to be in just to even have an understanding of the lay of the land, because if we're consuming it from where we usually are, which is the media, it's very bite-sized. So I want to commend people on a really sunny afternoon for being in this space, because this is a very important space in terms of the other spaces to be in. I think, I'm sorry, I've got the door open. They've just decided to do some soaring or some sort. So if you can hear noise, apologies. But I think there's two things about identifying campaigning groups, so organisations such as Unjust UK, and then following them and understanding what the work that they're doing is and how you can get involved. So one of the things I advocate is we are always looking for experienced people with expertise. So if you're a graphic designer or you're a content writer, or there's stuff that you do in your day job and you'd really like to get involved, there's ways you can use those skills for voluntary sector organisations that often maybe don't have the reach into some of those professional circles. So that's a way that you use your skills to enable those organisations that are at the front line or are in the civil society spaces to keep doing it. And I suppose the other way is, going on to good old Eventbrite and finding those spaces where you can learn from others, but also having conversations at your kitchen table if you still are allowed to socialize with family, because it all starts at home as well. So sharing what you're learning in these spaces with the people around you, as well as wanting to be in the more, I suppose, campaigning or bigger spaces. And I think having these conversations at home as well as being outside.
Femi, I'm going to come to you in a second to talk about a question relating to the media narrative and your views on that. So I'll just plant that thought. Ollie, actually, funny enough, I was going to come to you and I just saw you raise your hand. And if I could just tack on a couple of extra questions, Ollie, that you might want to roll in, if that's okay. So one of the questions came from someone in the audience involved in an Amnesty local group. What advice or what do we think we can best do to make use of coalitions to fight the bill, and what role can local groups play in that? And there's also a question which is asked whether we actually think that the bill has been brought forward during the pandemic, partly because that means that protests can be portrayed as irresponsible, but what are the best ways, what kind of messaging do we think can then best help to avoid reinforcing that narrative as we protest the bill? So sorry you had a kind of few of those thoughts there, but do you want to kind of try and bring thoughts on all of them if you can?
I'll do my best, Sasha. I mean, I think the first observation I wanted to make, and there's an inherent confusion, I think, about some of the criticism that comes for people opposing this bill, because I read time and time again that COVID restrictions mean that we shouldn't be protesting. Now, the point here is this bill isn't about a COVID restriction. We all understand that there are very strong public health reasons for restrictions that we all have to follow. And by the way, there was an inherent confusion around that, because it was never your Article 10 and Article 11 rights on the fundamental right to freedom of assembly and protest were limited but not removed by COVID restrictions. That was proved in court, and the regulations change daily. So the restrictions on gatherings are no longer there. So people must take their own choices to be safe, but you are allowed to gather and you are allowed to make your voice known. You always were. But this bill's about a permanent change. It's not about COVID. It's about how the police and criminal justice system across an enormously wide range of views. I mean, I've been listening to the committee stage of the bill that's been going through Parliament today. Just prior to the stuff on protest, they were talking about new offences for sexual grooming and kind of sexual offences against children. Immediately after defeating the amendment to remove the restrictions on travellers, they were talking about new offences for dangerous driving. The bill jumps around all over the place, which is why it's so dangerous, because it gives the whataboutery argument. So someone can say, well, what about this? What about that? I think all the panelists have mentioned that. And to come back to the question about what we can do, I think this is an alliance of unusual suspects. The way to defeat this bill is to bring together all of the disparate voices. Now, it's not just us as a group of friends who are threatened by the right to protest. There are all sorts of other groups that protest on all sorts of issues, some of which we may not agree with, but we agree with their right to be able to do it. And we need to bring together the Black community voices. We need to bring together the Roma Gypsy travellers. We need to bring together the ramblers and the wild campers and the canoeists, even maybe the lorry drivers who find themselves under the restrictions on unauthorised encampments. There are all sorts of unknown consequences that may well emerge from this bill. So a broad coalition of alliances that joins together as many disparate voices from as many different political perspectives is the way that we can make progress. But let's be under no illusion, it's going to be a difficult one.
Katrina, I think you had a thought to bring in.
Yeah, my thought was also that about the opposing. I totally agree with what Ollie was saying, but then also I'm not the pessimist, but then the pragmatic person me thinks, okay, if we can't stop it, what happens afterwards? And I think local authorities are going to have a big role to play in terms of like the encampment staff, in terms of the protesting staff, because people protest in a local area first, and then it kind of gets bigger. So I'm thinking of Westminster Council. When we think of the MPs not listening, I think there's a big role in your local area for, and I don't know how Amnesty groups, whether they're regional or how they're set up, but definitely about working to challenge the local authority or hold them to account by their public sector duty, I think is going to be key as this develops.
Thank you. Femi, can I come to you with a question that relates to the media narrative? So actually first maybe just giving us your sense of where that stands at the moment between, not covering it in a very hostile way, any sympathy in any area. And then I think in particular, what can campaigners like ourselves best do to help that narrative support the campaign? You may be on mute, Femi, sorry.
Yeah, you're right. As far as the media narrative goes, yeah, it blew up slightly, especially when you saw the violence in Bristol, but it's been essentially silent since then, which is extremely scary. And I've pushed contacts to try and get people to talk about it, but there's been very little desire to talk about it, and that is troubling. Now, how the media handles it on the few occasions that it does handle it, essentially the people, as you mentioned before, there is a narrative around, well, this is just to protect us from COVID, that it's some sort of temporary thing and that it's wholly justified on grounds of public health. And the media has done very little to combat that. There is a narrative that is fueled by the government that this is about preventing the serious violence that we've seen in terms of the attacks on police at the Bristol riots, in terms of the minority in Black Lives Matter, and the media has done almost nothing to challenge that. And so the government is going to be using the violence that happened in the past and any violence that happens between now and the bill passing to justify passing the bill, which is why I think it's really important that we as campaigners do our best to limit any violence that happens in the run-up to the bill, knowing that violence is almost an inevitable consequence of this bill. Because the phrase that often gets used is, the fastest way to start a riot is to stop a protest. If you tell police that they need to physically interact with any protest they see raising their voice, you will get violence, because the people of this country will not stand for the idea that the right to peaceful protest is taken away from them. So you will get violence. However, prior to the bill passing, any violence that is perpetrated by people in the public will be used by Priti Patel and the government as a tool to say, look, protests are out of control. We need to push these things down in the name of law and order. That is the narrative that they will be pushing. So that is what we can do to really refine the narrative on this thing. Say, look, they are attacking peaceful protests. I mean, you saw what happened when they attacked Patsy, I forget her last name, but the protester at the vigil of the Sarah Everard vigil. They threw her to the ground, several male police officers, when she was protesting against violence by a male police officer against a woman. That image was so powerful in terms of what this government, the direction this government is heading. However, in terms of public sympathy, you do not get the same amount when you see people throwing Molotov cocktails at police vans. That's what we need to be. The more peaceful we are, the more powerful we are.
Luke wants to come in there, and actually, Luke, I've got a couple of questions that are very specifically for you to pick up as well. But do you want to come in on that thought? Now I'll come back to you with questions.
I'll be very quick. All I would say is that, look, I'm not going to call out anybody for protesting, whether they do it, nicely or they do it wrongly or whatever, because frankly, I don't care. What I care about is the fact that the police have shown themselves time and time again in Bristol, in the Sarah Everard vigils and things like that. They have shown themselves to be the perpetrators of some of the worst violence. The media is not going to go, you're behaving yourselves, therefore we're going to be on your side. The media is run by about 4 billionaires, and they're all pals with the government. At this point in a democracy, the government should be courting the press, not the press courting the government, and that's what we're seeing. As a society that's going down this path, in the next 10 years, we're going to have trillionaires, not billionaires, and we're going to have people who are very destitute. When that happens, they keep needing to find scapegoats. So whether they feed the machine black people, whether they feed the machine Muslims, whether they feed it gypsies, Roma, travellers, and the rest of it, they have to keep finding scapegoats, because if not, people are going to sit there and go, well, it's actually those people with all the power, and they're causing our society to be like this. But yeah, like I say, the press will, I don't think the media narrative will ever be on our side, frankly. And I don't think we need a majority of this country to stop this bill. I just think it has to be a substantial amount. A couple of million people would end this bill forever, personally. If they saw a couple of million people on the streets, they would be afraid and they'd pull this bill because they'd be scared. But like I said, I think what Katrina was saying as well, it's not just about protests, right? It's about talking to your friends, your family, educating them about gypsies and travellers, educating them about what minorities go through with the police, educating them about police violence, and that's what it is. But yeah, I'm not going to call out anybody, and I don't think there's any good and bad protest. I think there's just protests, and people choose to take their power in different ways. And personally, I wouldn't engage in that sort of protest. But at the same time, I don't think it's helpful to be like, oh yeah, we'll throw some people protesting against this bill under the bus. At the end of the day, the police will come either way, and they will batter you either way. So they don't care. And I've seen that with my own eyes. So anyway, thank you.
Thanks, Luke. I had a comment, and I should apologise. Apparently, my sound on my microphone was a little bit echoey. They asked me to move the mic, so that's why I'm going to keep my finger here. That's also proof, if we needed it, the questions are real and they are coming in live. We're hearing them, but hopefully that's made the sound a little bit better. Luke, I'm going to come to you with 2 questions. I'm going to just plant a thought with Ollie with one of the other questions. We had a question in if someone could explain how the bill affects Scotland within the overall UK. So if I can come to you in a minute with that particular question, Ollie. But Luke, I've got 2 for you. One, it's a question, but actually in a way I think it's possibly halfway to a request, which is there a model resolution relating to the anti-Gypsy Roma traveller legislation that can be given to trade union, faith groups, etc. to pass resolution? So question, but possibly a request if there isn't. Then the second question is, for some of our audience who are involved in local groups, are you aware of an initiative, or is there an initiative that you can point to which local groups can get involved in to try and create greater engagement between settled communities and Gypsy Roma traveller communities, so as to try and break down stereotypes and break down dehumanisation? So, Luke, would you like to take both of those? Now I'll come to Ollie with a question relating to differences in how things are affected in Scotland.
Yeah, so I could take that. Yeah, so the model motion stuff, so I've been working with certain political parties and things and trade unions and organisations such as the charities like FFT, Traveller Movement, and thinking about how we get a definition of anti-Gypsyism, anti-traveller racism, because the one used in Europe, the IHRA one, as we know, there's been problems with IHRA definitions all over the place. But yeah, so the IHRA is mainly applies to European Roma, and they have like a slightly different situation to Gypsies and Travellers, which this bill mainly affects. So there is motions in, it's just getting everyone to agree on it. So there is sort of those conversations taking place. In terms of initiative groups trying to create greater engagement, right, here's where you're going to face the problem. Our community is extremely skeptical of outsiders because for their own safety. This puts it in perspective for you just what we face in this country. So the last couple of a few months back in Stoke, near Stoke upon Trent, it's near Staffordshire, basically, they had a mob form, an angry mob form, people throwing fireworks and people like that, like a lynch mob basically formed against the Gypsies and Travellers that had arrived in that area. So that's the kind of violence we're facing, petrol bombs going towards sites, our youth being beaten up in the streets, people having Nazi swastikas, you know, graffitied all up the side of their homes. That's what we're sort of facing. So obviously that leads us to be suspicious of the outside world. Obviously how we're treated in schools, how we're treated in hospitals, you know, by nurses, doctors, lawyers, everything under the sun. That has basically created us in a bubble, because that's what we have to do to stay safe. But there's lots of people like me that are reaching out, trying to educate people and things like that. So I say, like, there's plenty of people that you can invite to speak at your, you know, Labour Party, CLP, Green Party, Lib Dem, everything else, and they'll happily come and speak to you. The big charities, FFT and Traveller Movement, are pretty good. They've got a lot of educational resources. Travellers Times has got some educational resources. So just to educate yourself and also have those conversations with your family, like Katrina was saying earlier on about the bill, right? When somebody says the word pikey, I say it once because it is a slur, it is racist. When people say things like that, challenge them on it, say that this isn't okay. And, you know, change doesn't just come from people out in the streets to run shit. Change comes from, it has to filter to society, right? If I educate, you know, 5 people on the video now, and they go and educate 10 people, and then they go and educate, that's how we create long-lasting change. But in terms of creating greater engagement, well, if you see Gypsies and Travellers in your local shop, don't go, oh, the Gypsies and Travellers are here, let's not talk to them, aren't they? They're going to hurt us or something. Just be like, oh, how are you? You know, good evening. What you do to your neighbours, start treating us like human beings, and you'll be very surprised. We're actually quite hospitable people. In terms of, if you make friends of us, we're usually quite loyal. You know, we'll invite you in for a cup of tea. Do you know what I mean? If it wasn't COVID, you'd probably get people invite you in for a bit of cake or something. That's what we are. You never leave a traveller's place hungry. We'll feed you everything. We give lots of money to charity, but the media doesn't want to talk about it. This is why I'm skeptical of people that say the media is going to save us. They ain't going to save you. They don't want to talk about Gypsy and Travellers that have been to university, doctors, everything under the sun, barristers. They only want to talk about the negative groups. And this is how these protests are always going to be framed. They're always going to be framed negatively, because we threaten, as the people, we threaten billionaires who own the press. We threaten Boris Johnson and the rest of them. Our existence is radical, basically, and they don't like it. We threaten landlords. That's why they can't have private property. You know, all unauthorised encampments. You know, the Enclosures Act basically cordoned off most of this land, and we can't go fishing, wild camping on a lot of the land and things like that. But yeah, that's what I'd say. Create greater engagement by not having your kids go into school and be racist against people from our community. Make schools accessible and safe. Simple. These are small things, small steps. Thank you.
Thanks, Luke. I'm going to go to Ollie. So there's a question obviously about the bill affecting Scotland. Actually, if I could just add this second question, Ollie, and then maybe if Femi or Katrina, you want to come in on either of the questions, just raise your hands, absolutely. The second question, Ollie, sorry to bombard you, is could you explain the Labour Party's current position, specifically anything that's happened today, but I think perhaps just stepping back more broadly, the summary of the Labour Party's position in relation to the bill?
Okay, so this is the cop-out answer, because the situation for Scotland is complicated. As you know, policing is a devolved matter. So in theory, the policing restrictions on noisy and annoyance and the new threshold for public nuisance don't apply to the police in Scotland. So I think one of the areas here is the main danger is policy change by osmosis. Is that the right word? So, like, you know, because it's done in England, it will gradually shift over. But there are other things around operation. There's quite a lot of close operational work between UK police, England-based police, and Scottish-based police. So, for example, in September, there's the COP Climate Change Summit in Glasgow, and as is quite usual for these things, teams of Metropolitan Police are going to come up to augment the Police Scotland force, because they don't have the capacity to deal with an event of that large scale. They did the same thing at the G8, G7 conferences a few years ago, and there's already real concern around dual standards operating. So, you know, which form of the law is the Met Police going to work to the English system, and how is it going to be accountable? Because Scotland has a very different kind of human rights framework for its policing. As you will see, there was a case in the media a couple of weeks ago with the UK Border Agency trying to remove a couple of people from the UK, and the people on the streets came out in solidarity to say, we're not going to have this. And Police Scotland took the decision on human rights grounds, for the welfare of everybody involved, to stop the border agency proceeding with the eviction. Now with the removal, sorry, that's a very different policing response. So you have different policing in different countries, and that's in different nations and regions of the UK, and that's going to be a real challenge. And it actually came up today in the Bill Committee hearing. It wasn't to do with Scotland, but it was to do with Wales. And I might have misquoted this, but the MP representing Plaid Cymru pointed out that the ministerial powers that allow ministers to define further what noisy and annoyance might be at some future date cuts across the Welsh devolution powers for maintaining public order in Wales. And I think those sorts of anomalies are going to crop up all over the place in this bill, because it's such an enormous and complicated bill. I think that's half answered it. On the Labour Party. So today, I think some people have been rightly critical that at the start of the bill, the Labour Party seemed to be slightly lukewarm. But today, they tabled amendments to remove Part 3 and Part 4 in their entirety. They spoke up very strongly about not watering down our centuries-old traditions on rights of protest, making all the things we would want them to make. They spoke out very strongly for not criminalising and persecuting Gypsy and Roma travelling communities. So they were on point on that point, arguing very strongly. Unfortunately, they lost the votes. Yeah, they lost a series of votes on the amendments, 8-4, 7-2, 8-2, 7-2. So, you know, they're a much smaller voice in Parliament now. But for now, they're holding the line. What I don't know is, I'll maybe just ask whether Katrina knows where the position they are on the serious violence reduction orders, because I know that they wanted to amend the sections on criminal on the new public duty in section 2, which is essentially the public duty of agencies to coordinate to reduce serious violence. They wanted to put a load of kind of safeguarding amendments, but they weren't necessarily opposing it. So I don't know where they stand on those elements of the bill. But in terms of protest, in terms of Gypsy travellers and unauthorised encampments, they are definitely on the side of us wanting to remove them. And on the other side, to do with the kind of racial disproportionality and the institutional racism side, I think they're on an amendment course for that.
Katrina, did you want to come in with anything on adding into that?
Not really, other than I really, because of especially because of how the position of the serious violence part, I'm endeared to hear that they're challenging the multi-agency bit, but I wouldn't be surprised if there's not much murmurs around the serious reduction orders, because I don't think people want to seem to as though they don't care about knife crime, although those orders will do nothing to address knife crime. So I think it's staying silent around the things that they think actually they sound good in theory and may work. And that's not me saying that's the Labour Party line, but I can understand why we're probably not hearing much noise around that bit, because, and I also think it goes maybe speaking to in some ways, because young black males are disproportionately impacted by knife crime, although they're not the majority of perpetrators. is that that is not necessarily a group that are inclined to vote or are political. So maybe the noise isn't just being made from communities. And I have to say, I don't hear many parents speaking about it being a bad thing. So I just don't think there's a lot of heat coming to politicians around that particular part of the bill, which is quite saddening, to be honest.
Thanks, Katrina. I'm afraid we are approaching the end, towards the end of our time. So I'm going to in a minute ask each of our panelists to be able to say a few words. And maybe in particular, actually, you know, this is the opportunity for your call to action. So I don't know if it's just myself or everyone who can kind of see the sense of the numbers, but just in case, because sometimes on screens, it's hard to get a sense actually of how many people have come and how engaged people are. We've had close to 200 people here on a sunny evening in this group. So, you know, there's a big group of us here. So Amnesty will be following up in an email with text for emailing MPs to raise the issue. There's going to be actions in June. But Femi, do you want to come in with your kind of last thoughts and any call to action for this group from yourself? And then I'll come to Katrina and then Luke. Femi, you're mute, sorry.
So as already been said, the dinner table is going to be a key tool in this. Speaking to people who are in your life about just how bad this situation is key, because I don't think people fully understand, fully get it. It's been the media narrative around this being just about COVID or just to prevent violence and protests. That's been done very well, but there is a reason why this government puts Greenpeace on a terrorist watch list last year. There is a reason why they put Extinction Rebellion on a terrorist watch list last year. There's a reason why they said they banned capitalist materials from being used in schools. There's a reason why they said it's illegal to teach about white privilege in schools. There's a reason why they cited the fact that people felt uncomfortable outing themselves as Brexiteers. There's a reason why they needed to introduce a free speech championship university. This government hates opposition, and they are putting every measure possible by stealth, bit by bit, to erode it. Now, the key thing about this right to protest is, if that right goes, then all the other rights they want to strip from us, it'll be a lot harder to claw those back. Because if we lose that right to protest, if everybody knows that if they go out to protest, there's a very real risk that they might end up with a £2,000 fine, it will have a chilling effect on anybody's ability to go out. Because we already have a problem of protests being a bit too middle class. Can you imagine if you are struggling financially? Are you going to go to a protest when you think you might be fined £2,500? This is going to disproportionately affect people with the least. And people most likely to be arrested at those protests, well, we know who those are going to be. People who statistically are the most likely to be arrested. So that's going to be your minority. That's going to be the people who have the least. So this bill is dangerous. Speak to your friends. Get them involved. Get them registered to vote in the long term, because that's also crucial. But make sure this is clear. Show the media that people have their eyes on this thing, because violence is going to be a result of this, and we need to have that conversation now if we're going to avoid it. So please get involved with the Noise and Annoying campaign. Deborah Francis White and Guilty Feminists are working with it alongside myself. And use the hashtag Noise and Annoying, and I'll try and keep an eye out and tell your story about the rights that you benefit from, be it that you are married to your same-sex partner, be it you are someone at the top of your profession, from an ethnic minority, disability. Show how the rights that we've got now were won through people being noise and annoying, because that's the country we are, that's the people we are. Show that. Thank you.
Thank you, Femi. Katrina.
I think in terms of what can we do about the bill, I think we have to have a real honest conversation around how we solve serious youth violence. Because I say take that out, not serious youth violence, just serious violence. It's not about it's a youth thing. I keep saying monkey see, monkey do. It's a lot of adults that commit violence, and children are then replicating that. So, you know, no one's born inherently violent. So I think we have to ask, where do we want our society to be in? And I would say it's one where we are not police led for societal problems. We have to have strong conversations around reinvesting public resources into adequate housing, into education, into employment. We're coming off the back of COVID, where we've seen Black, Asian, ethnic minority community groups disproportionately harmed by COVID, not because of DNA, just because of their socio-economic status. So where people are gonna, it's a very good opportunity to start society again in some ways. And what this bill does is definitely pull us back into the dark ages in terms of us having the social fabric. So similar to what Femi has said, is speak to your family, but I do think there's a really big role to ask yourself, how do you see society being, and how do you feel safe? Does prisons make you feel safe? And I would say we actually need to start educating ourselves about different models. So I'd really implore you to read a book called Until We Reckon. It's by a lady called Danielle Surd, and it's around restorative justice, because I think we keep expecting the criminal justice system to make us safe, and actually it very rarely does. The people that go in usually come out far worse, less likely to integrate into society, and the people that are harmed by those people don't feel any safer having those people gone through that system. They may have a little bit of reprieve than be in prison, but ultimately they usually come out. So I think we need to rethink policing, prisons, the whole approach, and have a bigger investment in public services, and leave the police to police, but let's not give them more and more powers that we end up in a police state, as opposed to the world that we need to live in. So yeah, that's my kind of plea to you, to people here today, is to read that book, Until We Reckon, and to follow us on Twitter, Unjust or French Katrina. I'm not really good at plugging myself. Yeah.
Thank you, Katrina. And Luke, I'm going to leave the last panelist word to yourself.
Yeah, so I just think something we really do need to come together from all communities, from all backgrounds, and really get rid of this bill, because this is, it's not just me that's saying it. There's plenty of academics out there, there's plenty of people that, whose job is to sort of document this stuff, is saying that, this is potentially the start of a descent into like authoritarianism, quite a bad authoritarianism. And I mean, it looks like to me that they're tooling themselves up for potential unrest, and when massive inequality happens, when people are upset that they can't feed their families, when, for example, furlough ends, when people start losing their jobs, what happens then? We have to have a really serious conversation in this country about, if you want to solve crime, that's fine. I'm all down for that. But you really need to look at actually what solves crime, what prevents crime. Grassroots investment in boxing is a good example for my community, right? Loads of youth have been saved from serious crime by going into boxing, by it shows them discipline, things like that. It's like a replacement for youth clubs. Serious investment in sort of grassroots sport, and education, housing, right? The thing is, there's only one link. Priti Patel says, communities like mine are inherently criminal. The truth is, nobody's inherently criminal. The only link to crime and anything else is crime and poverty. That's the only link that ever been proven, ever, right? And it's not a common look. When people say about my community being inherently criminal and the rest of it, right? There's no coincidence that my community, Bangladeshi, Pakistani, the Black community, we all experience similar outcomes. Then you look at the way society treats us. The common denominator is not what race you come from, it's the way society treats people from your background. And we need to have a serious conversation about that as well. But all I would say is, this is my call to action, is that you really need to do a bit more than just writing to your MP. You need to do, educate people at the dinner table. That's really noble. That's a really good way of doing things, right? But I do think you're going to have to show this government, as uncomfortable as it is, and like, it's not natural for gypsies and travellers. It's not something I'm comfortable with, going to protest and the rest of it. But sometimes you have to look where history goes in the past and where it potentially could be going, and ask yourself, is this potentially going to be the last chance I'm going to get to have my voice heard and say that I don't want this society going down this route? So get out on the streets and really show them how angry you are. Thank you.
Thank you, Luke. Thank you to our panelists. I think it's a sign that even though we've overrun by a few minutes, I can see on the numbers that we haven't had participants in this drop-off. There is a really committed group, but it's going to have to be, isn't it? Our rights are at risk. We're going to need to campaign together. We are campaigning together to work together to protect them. We've held back bad laws before, but this is a very, very, very tough battle. But we've got to fight that battle. I know there are lots of Amnesty members who've been watching this. If anyone's watching this and isn't currently a member, I think there's a link in the chat box where you can join Amnesty and help us to support the rights that we share, alongside joining in and participating in the ways that Femi and Katrina and Luke outlined as well. I think you can do that via amnesty.org.uk/policing bill. The link's in the chat box. I know how much everyone has to do in their lives. Campaigning isn't easy. It's something that takes up time, it takes up effort, but I'd like to thank everyone who joined today, everyone who asked a question, and in particular our panelists, Katrina, Femi, and Luke today, and Ollie, who joined to answer questions. Thank you so much, and goodbye everyone for this evening.